out here at our lot in Pittsburgh, California. We have a nice cypress log here that we procured from a friend, and we're going to show you some tips and tricks on how to use the mill for the first time. I've got Justin here with me. He's my sawyer for today. He'll be doing the cutting, and I'll just be doing the talking. So, the first thing that we want to look at when you get an Alaskan mill is what chainsaw do you have? Do you have enough power to do the job that you want to do? In this case, we have about a 30-inch diameter cypress log. We have a 90cc chainsaw here, which is more than sufficient to do the job. You could actually cut this probably with a 70cc to 80cc saw as well, successfully. The next thing that you want to make sure you have when you get an Alaskan mill is ripping chain. Ripping chain cuts faster, smoother, and stays sharper longer. If you want to look at the cut we made previously on this log, you can see how smooth the texture of the cut is. The other thing that you're going to need with the Alaskan mill is some kind of first cut system. We used our easy rails to make the first cut on this log. We have a less expensive system called our slabbing rail brackets, which you attach to 2x4s. Those are also very effective. They're not as versatile as easy rails. Or some people just use an aluminum ladder, or you can use even a 2x8. Something to level the log for your first cut. The next thing you need to do is inspect the log for any contamination in the bark. If the log has been in a dirty situation, in a dirt yard, and has been rolled in the dirt, it's very important that you remove the bark where you're going to be cutting, and if possible, remove the bark from the whole log. If it's grown in a very clean spot and the tree has just fallen in the forest, that's not necessary in most cases that you do that. However, the bark sometimes, especially in logs like redwood and sequoia, the bark is very fibrous, and it's advisable to remove the bark if you can. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the mill that we've selected is going to cut the log that's available to us. In this case, I have a 28 inches from post to post on this mill. It's the log is a little bit too large on the far end down here, so in order to get the mill across it, I'm going to trim off a portion of where the log comes out here at the end. Justin's going to do that before we cut. Today I'd like to show you how to mount the Alaskan sawmill onto a chainsaw bar. I have here a 36-inch Alaskan Mark IV sawmill, and what that means is that the rail and handle set are 36 inches long. Now the saw bar itself has a cutting distance of 36 inches. In order to mount this mill on here and miss the sprocket nose and be away from the power head a little bit, I have to adjust the mill in from the outboard side. So when I assembled the mill, I tightened up the end brackets at 7 inches on each post and tightened these carriage bolts flush with the set of cross rails. This system is now complete, and the handle, cross handle, is tightened using the Allen wrench that we provide, and this tightened up. So this system is now set. The outboard side is not set. These carriage bolts, the hand, so we can adjust it. So I'm going to slide it onto the saw bar. Before you put it on your saw bar, you should make sure that the saw bar is clean, that doesn't have any oil on the bar where you're going to be mounting it. And in this case, this is a sprocket nose bar with a replaceable tip, and some of the rivets were a little proud. I took a flat file and I filed them down so that the clamping bracket pad will sit flush on here. Okay, so now it's time to mount the Alaskan onto the saw bar. Now you can see I've got the saw sitting in this orientation. this may seem obvious, but for some people, they may try and mount the sawmill like this, which would not be correct, okay? The saw teeth move from the top of the bar, around the nose, and back in this direction on the bottom of the saw bar. And that's the way the saw has to be sitting for you to mount this. So I've loosened the brackets so that there's some space for the saw bar. Just going to slide it forward. It's important that you leave yourself some room for the end bracket to slide up and down at the power end side of the bar. So I'm going to put it about right there. It's also important that these pads sit right in the middle of the saw bar. So there's equal distance from this rail and this rail to the edge of each of the pads at this end and at the power head end. Now I'm going to tighten up the clamping bolts on the power end side. To do that, I need a couple of tools. I prefer to use a ratchet with a half-inch drive, half-inch socket, a 3/8 drive ratchet. And then we're also going to need, which we supply with the sawmill, the Allen wrench for tightening the Allen bolts that hold the handle in place. So, I'm going to go ahead and tighten these bolts down evenly. Double check that the mill is in the middle of the bar. And go ahead and tighten these up. It's important that these are done equally, so the same amount of fastener is engaged in the nut that's welded to the bottom of this bracket. Now I'm just going to tighten it lightly at this point, just so the mill doesn't move around. Now I'm going to go to the other end of the sawmill. Make sure the pad has stayed in the middle, which it has, and that it's in the right position relative to the sprocket, that's not impinging on the sprocket. Now before I tighten these bolts up, I'm going to tighten up these two carriage bolts and the Allen bolt here on the handle. The post is already square to the end bracket. This is going to put the rest of the mill square with the end bracket. And I'm going to tighten up the handle boss. Now this assembly is completely square to the post and the end bracket. Now when I tighten it up on the saw bar, everything will be square to one another. Now I go ahead and tighten this up equally. Now I can go ahead and tighten these bolts. Now it's important, these are grade 5 bolts, and they're meant to be tightened to 12 to 13 pounds of torque. Now most people don't have a torque wrench out here, so the procedure I follow is I make them tight. Then I put a little bit more on it. It's very important that these bolts and this clamping bracket is attached securely to the saw bar. You don't want it moving when you're cutting. Now I'll go down the other end and finish tightening these guys. Tighten them equally. Now that we have the post assemblies tight onto the saw bar, I'm going to just check that all the other fasteners are tight before we start to set up and mill with it. So I'm just going to go around the mill and make sure that these are all securely fastened. So that should be it. We should now be ready to adjust the mill so we can go ahead and do some milling. When you're ready to start milling, it's really important that your tools are all together in one place. I recommend the following: half-inch socket with the ratchet handle, half-inch wrench, box end, and the Allen wrench that comes with the mill for adjusting the handle bosses if necessary. You also will need a hammer, and I recommend that you have a drill driver in your pack for adjusting the sliding rail brackets and easy rails if you're using them. And there's also a place here for some wedges, which you'll need when you mill. And that's basically all you need, except perhaps a tape measure. Important. As you're probably aware, chainsaws are potentially dangerous pieces of equipment. The Alaskan Mill essentially puts a guard around the chainsaw bar, which is a nice safety feature. However, we highly recommend the following things: that you purchase and wear chaps to guard your legs, that you wear boots, that you wear proper ear protection and eye protection, and that you have gloves. An accessory that's necessary for milling and that you should come prepared with are some wedges. We cut these just with a bandsaw out of some hardwood material. They can be about that size. I prefer wood over plastic because the wood tends to hold once you put it in the saw cut. Justin is armed with a few, so he's ready to put them in place as he's cutting. And also you can lay them out on the saw log itself in the approximate position where you're going to be putting the wedges. Wedges are essential for milling because you don't want the log, the slab you're cutting, coming down onto the log. It tends to pinch the saw. You don't want to wedge too much, however, and raise the slab up, because that'll throw off the accuracy of the milling as well. So you just put them in lightly until they hold, and that's all that's necessary. So now we're ready to make your first cut with the sawmill. There's a way to begin the cut that I recommend that is more stable and it's easier to do. And Justin's going to demonstrate that for you right now without running the saw. Essentially, you start with the skids against the diameter of the log, the first guide rail right on the edge here in the corner, and then he's going to rotate the saw into the log, keeping it level, engaging the on-off bar. So we stopped the milling process for a moment, thank you, Justin, to illustrate just a few more things that you need to pay attention to when you're milling. As you can see, at the front leading edge of the guide rail here, I'm pushing the sawdust up pretty equally all the way along there. When you're milling, you should be looking on a diagonal basis across the mill and the log to make sure that you're keeping this rail down on the log. It requires just a little bit of forward pressure with your handle, and it's better to support the power head just a little bit in an upward position with your left hand so that it's balanced, because the saw left by itself, the saw would want to rise the end of the mill up because of the weight of the saw. So you just slightly balance it with just a little bit of up pressure. Also, when you're milling, it's very important that the sound of the saw is, you're aware of the sound of the saw. You want the saw running at full RPM, but loaded just a little bit so that it cuts continually at the same rate. That way you won't get any overcutting that goes on by people who are just jamming the mill and coming back, working it back and forth. If you just push evenly, keep the RPMs up and the feed rate gentle, because the saw wants to pull itself into the log by itself. So you just have to guide that. Don't overpress it. If you keep stalling the saw, it's bad for the clutch. It'll load up the chain and it'll make a messy cut. So you can see when Justin's running this that he's keeping the RPMs right up there.